Weathering the storm. Forest succession in Point Pleasant Park after Hurricane Juan.
Hi, in this study, we are going to explore the ecological succession of major climate event Hurricane Juan on Point Pleasant Park. Point Pleasant Park, located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, is more than just an urban green space. Urban forests provide a home for animals, plants, giving human a peaceful nature. However, in September 2003, Hurricane Juan caused a huge damage to the park by uprooting thousands of trees. This gave us a great opportunity to examine how these urban forests were recovering to the climate community. Point Pleasant Park is culturally significant for the Mi'kmaq Nation, making it important to integrate the indigenous perspective with ecological studies. Understanding the dynamics is critical as climate change intensifies damage like hurricane. For the Mi'kmaq Nation, land is not just a physical space but a living form that is connected with their way of life. In our objectives, we are going to talk about how the secondary succession helped ecosystem recovered, explore how ecosystem develop into a climate community over time, and highlighting the role of urban parks in supporting biodiversity and ecological balance. Our hypothesis. Hurricane Juan will have no significant relationship on plant succession in Point Pleasant Park, and the species compositions remain unchanged over time.
In order to understand the ecological succession in Point Pleasant Park after Hurricane Juan, data was collected in six 20 by 20 meter study sites, as seen in this figure. These plots were established in 2004 in areas that experienced the highest impact from the hurricane. In each site, all the living trees with a diameter of at least 2.5 centimeters at breast height, or DBH, were identified and measured with a diameter tape, and DBH was taken at 4.5 feet from the ground, following industry standards. The density of each species per 400 square meters was calculated to assess how the forest composition would change over time. Additionally, a linear regression analysis was performed to examine trends in the total tree density, DBH, species richness, Shannon diversity index, and evenness. Linear regression analysis was also performed as it allows researchers to quantify trends over time and determine whether changes in the forest community follow a predictable pattern. The collected data spans from 2004 to 2024, with gaps in 2005, 2007, 2016, and 2020 due to other hurricanes and the COVID-19 pandemic. This has allowed us to gain insight into the forest community's development post-hurricane disturbance and how it may continue to change in the future. In order to understand the changes in the park over time, we pose the following question: how has the forest community changed over time and why? Our null hypothesis is that there will be no relationship between the tree density and year from 2004 to 2024. This figure represents the total density of trees in Point Pleasant Park over time, showing a steady increase. The trend suggests the forest community is recovering steadily from Hurricane Juan's disturbance. Increased total density indicates progression from an early successional community to a more stable stage. The upward trajectory aligns with a classical forest succession model that predicts that over time, shade-tolerant late successional species will establish and outcompete earlier species, as proposed by Connell and Slater. Overall, the figure shows a strong positive increase in tree density over the years from 2004, right after the hurricane, to 2024. The R-squared value of 0.49 suggests that while density is increasing, other factors influence succession as well. The p-value that is less than 0.001 confirms statistical significance, reinforcing that the observed increase in density is not due to random variation. However, the variability in the dataset suggests natural disturbances also affect succession rates. The trend line shows a clear increase in tree density over time, with the R-squared value of 0.49 suggesting moderate correlation. The steady rise in density reflects natural forest succession following the severe disturbance caused by the hurricane. Based on our statistical results, we reject our null hypothesis because of the relationship between total tree density and year. Looking ahead, we predict that the forests will continue to transition towards a more stable forest community. However, several factors could influence this trajectory, such as species competition, carrying capacity, invasive species, climate change, or other significant storms. Therefore, while we expect continued growth in density and diversity, management strategies will play a crucial role in shaping the forest's long-term trajectory.
In 2004, red spruce was the dominant species in the forest. In the role of strategist, it means it has slow growth but long-lived and stabilized population in a stable environment. Due to its density, it does not rapidly increase in population and contains a small population size. The graph told us the changes in dominant species after the Hurricane Juan from 2004 to 2024 has tended towards a climate community. Over time, we can predict that community will shift to a more stable ecosystem, with species best adapted to the long-term conditions being dominant. Therefore, we reject our hypothesis because there is a significant relationship between the density of dominant species and year. By 2024, density of a dominant species red maple is tending to have rapidly recovered after the declines from Hurricane Juan in 2003. Graph showing us that it is a well-adapted species to the environmental change and disturbance. From 2004 to 2024, the density of a dominant species red maple has significantly increased to the higher density 184 individuals in 2019. It drives the population towards a climax community. As a result, it has become the dominant species in the forest during this period, so that we reject our hypothesis since it has a positive relationship between the density of dominant species and year. Since both of the species have low 2R values, this suggests in that time does not strongly explain the variation in their population densities.
Understanding the recovery of species richness after a drastic event is important for conservation biology to be able to predict recovery after future events. Species richness was measured in multiple sites at Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, Nova Scotia from 2003 until 2024, after Hurricane Juan occurred in September of 2003. Figure 4 shows the recovery of species richness after the hurricane with the R-squared value and equation for the line. Using regression analysis between species richness and year, we found a significant positive relationship between species richness and year. Since our values were significant, this means we reject our null hypothesis that there is no relationship between species richness and year, and accept our alternate hypothesis that there is a relationship. As can be seen in figure 4, in the equation there is a positive slope with the, of 0.529, meaning there is a significant positive relationship between species richness and years. This means species richness has increased linearly from 2004 until 2024 following Hurricane Juan in Point Pleasant Park. The reason we saw this forest recovery was that many native species were returning to the area via nearby sources, spreading seeds as the forest followed a normal secondary succession trajectory. Since this forest is recovering following a standard secondary succession model, we can assume that as the forest reaches climax community, where there is very little change in species composition, there will be a decrease in the rate at which the species richness increases and eventually levels off. However, we may be able to expect that the new baseline of species richness will be higher than the original species richness, due to how the storm established microsites, which are new niches such as fallen down logs. In order to understand the recovery of species richness directly after a drastic event, we took a subset from figure 4 to create figure 5, which is from 2004 until 2014, the 10 years directly following Hurricane Juan in September 2003. This graph, using regression analysis between species richness and year on this graph, we found a significant positive relationship between species richness and year from 2004 to 2014. Since it is significant, it means species richness can be estimated from the year using the regression equation. As can be seen in figure 5, in the equation, there is a positive slope of the line of 0.529, meaning there is a significant positive relationship between species richness and year. This means that the species richness has increased linearly from 2004 to 2014, following Hurricane Juan in Point Pleasant Park. In order to understand the recovery of species richness a few years after a drastic event, we took another subset from figure 4 to create figure 6. This subset, however, was from 2015 to 2024, more than 10 years after Hurricane Juan in September 2003. In figure 6, we used regression analysis between species richness and year, and we failed to find a significant positive relationship between species richness and year. There is also an extremely low R-squared value, indicating that the values are randomly distributed. This means that species richness from 2015 to 2024 underwent random fluctuations rather than a predictable linear change. This indicates that the early stage of succession where species are arriving has ended from 2015 to 2024. Urban parks can undergo different forms of secondary succession than wild areas. An example of this is Point Pleasant's restoration, where they planted 70,000 trees after the storm to 2008. This would speed up the succession stage by creating more shaded areas in the park than there would normally be in the wild. Urban parks also differ from wild areas because they undergo cleanup. However, catastrophic events like hurricanes can create microsites like fallen logs, which can increase the diversity after succession has occurred. However, as a part of Point Pleasant's cleanup as an urban park, they are removing debris like logs. This would lead us not to see this expected increase that we see in the wild. So, in conclusion, Point Pleasant Park is in a middle stage of secondary succession, which is sped up by the planting of trees. This is indicated by how the tree density is still increasing due to shade-tolerant species still colonizing the open space. Also, the pioneer tree species red maple is still ahead in population, where the climax community it would be outcompeted by the red spruce. Species diversity has leveled off in recent years, indicating that early succession has ended and middle succession has begun. An indigenous practice that we could use for Point Pleasant is the process of Mitakuye Oyasin, the idea from the Lakota Nation that we are all related. This practice encourages us to take care of future generations since we are all related to everything around us. My assigned question was, how could the current succession of the park potentially change course based on future climate change and big weather events? Forests which undergo repeated disturbances can often never reach climax community and often have a wide variety of communities within them. Climate change is increasing the severity of large storms, which would lead to the communities impacted by these storms unable to reach climax communities due to constant setbacks. Repeated storms occurred in Point Pleasant Park in 2004, 2005, and 2007, 2016, severe enough to hinder data collection for that year. Despite this, the species richness and tree density have increased over time, indicating that succession is continuing and these storms did not significantly harm the community. This indicates that the storms that Point Pleasant experienced after Hurricane Juan are not as extreme as Hurricane Juan was. This does not mean that there will not be another Hurricane Juan-sized storm. In fact, we can expect storms which are more extreme due to climate change. These storms would set back succession and prevent Point Pleasant from reaching a climax community.
My assigned question was, how does the research on Point Pleasant Park post-Hurricane Juan contribute to understanding the long-term effects of hurricanes on forest ecosystems? The research conducted in Point Pleasant Park following Hurricane Juan provides valuable insight into the long-term effects of hurricanes on forest ecosystems. By analyzing 20 years of post-disturbance data, we have been able to track key ecological changes, including increases in tree density, species richness, and diversity. This long-term data set allows us to understand how a temperate forest naturally recovers from severe storm damage. One of the major contributions of this study to our understanding of hurricane effects is its support for the classical succession model. In the years following Hurricane Juan, the park was initially dominated by early successional species like birch and poplar, which established quickly in disturbed areas. However, over time, these species have been gradually replaced by mid and late successional species such as red spruce and sugar maple, reflecting the classical model of ecological succession proposed by Connell and Slater. Another important finding is the role of human influence in forest recovery. Unlike purely natural forests, urban parks like Point Pleasant Park are subject to management practices, invasive species, and recreational use, which can alter succession dynamics. This research highlights the need for conservation strategies that balance natural regeneration with human intervention to ensure long-term ecosystem stability. Overall, this study has significant predictive value with regards to other forest ecosystems. As hurricanes become more frequent and intense due to climate change, understanding how forests respond to disturbance is critical. By modeling recovery trends, we can better predict how future storms may impact temperate forests and develop resilience strategies for forest conservation. This study not only enhances our current understanding of post-hurricane forest recovery, but also provides critical data for managing and protecting forest ecosystems in a changing climate.
Point Pleasant Park policy of removing non-native species is aimed at restoring the nature biodiversity of the area. Invasive species often outcompete native plants and animals, disrupting ecosystem and reducing species richness. While the removal process can temporarily lower the biodiversity, it creates time and space for the native species to recover. Over time, this leads to more balanced and diverse ecosystem. The park's policy of removing non-native species play a key role in forest succession by allowing native species to recover. Although removing these species reduces overall plant diversity at first, it eventually promotes a more stable ecosystem, improving species richness in the long run.
We want to extend our gratitude to Dalhousie University and the Biology 2060 faculty for their guidance throughout this research. Additionally, we acknowledge the students and researchers who have contributed to field data collection from 2004 to 2024. We also would like to give a special thanks to the Mi'kmaq Nation for their traditional knowledge on Amtu-Kati and their insights into forest succession. Lastly, we recognize the efforts of Point Pleasant Park Management for maintaining the park and facilitating long-term ecological research.
Here are our references.